The silver ship moved through space like a ghost, its hull reflecting starlight as it approached the third planet from the yellow star. Commander Vexthal stood on the bridge watching the blue and green world grow larger on his screens. His three eyes focused on the data flowing across the displays while his subordinates worked quietly around him. This was routine work for the Zenthari Empire. Another survey mission to catalog primitive worlds and their resources. Science Officer Krianath turned from her station with confusion written across her scaled features. "Commander, the electromagnetic readings are wrong," she said, her voice carrying the musical tones of her species. "This world shows technology signatures far beyond what our long-range scans suggested." Vexthal moved to her station, his four arms working the controls with practiced ease. The readings made no sense according to their databases. Radio waves, television signals, satellite communications, and something else filled the space around the planet. The signals were chaotic, unorganized, and completely unlike anything they had encountered in 3,000 years of galactic exploration. "Perhaps the technology developed faster than expected," suggested Navigation Officer Roltek from his position near the rear of the bridge. "Some species make rapid advances when they discover certain principles." But Vexthal was not convinced. The Zenthari had studied thousands of worlds and millions of species. Technological development followed predictable patterns across the galaxy. Species developed mathematics first, then basic sciences, followed by organized communication systems, and finally space travel. The progression never varied because logic demanded efficiency. Yet the signals from this world suggested the inhabitants had somehow developed chaotic, inefficient systems that still functioned. High above the planet Earth, Captain Jake Morrison pushed himself along the outside of the International Space Station, checking solar panel connections during his scheduled spacewalk. The work was routine, something he had done dozens of times before. Earth spread out beneath him in blues and whites and browns, beautiful and peaceful from this height. He paused in his work to watch the sunrise paint the atmosphere in brilliant colors. Something caught his eye in the distance, a glint of light that did not match the familiar patterns of satellites and space debris. Jake turned his helmet cameras away from the station and focused on the strange object. It was too far away to see clearly, but its movement was wrong. Satellites followed predictable orbits, but this thing seemed to be changing direction without any visible means of propulsion. On the Zenthari bridge, alarms began to sound. "Commander," called Communications Officer Hexenal, "we are being observed." "Impossible," Vexthal replied. "Our stealth systems are active. No primitive species has the technology to detect us at this range." But on the screen, they could see the small figure in the white suit pointing directly at their position. Jake Morrison raised one gloved hand and waved at what he assumed was some kind of experimental aircraft. The gesture was friendly, curious, completely without fear or aggression. The aliens stared in stunned silence. In 3,000 years of exploration, no species had ever acknowledged their presence before formal contact protocols were established. Most primitive species could not even see their ships. Those few that could usually responded with fear or worship. But this small creature in its crude spacesuit had simply waved, as if greeting a neighbor. "What is it doing?" whispered Kraneth, before anyone could answer, their communication systems activated. Someone on the planet was broadcasting directly at their ship. Dr. Lisa Campbell sat in her office at the radio observatory, watching the strange readings on her equipment. She had detected the alien scanning frequencies 20 minutes ago and had been trying to establish communication ever since. First, she broadcast mathematical sequences, starting with prime numbers and moving to more complex equations. When that received no response, she tried the universal constant pi, calculated to 1,000 decimal places. Still nothing. Then she decided to try something different. Music began flowing from the Earth toward the alien ship. Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 3 filled the Zenthari communication systems, followed immediately by Mozart's Symphony No. 40. The aliens listened in growing amazement as the transmissions shifted to jazz, then rock and roll, then something their computers identified as heavy metal. Why is it sending us mathematical data mixed with organized sound waves? Asked Hexenol, struggling to understand the chaotic mix of logical and emotional expression. The humans continued broadcasting. Dr. Campbell added spoken messages in dozens of languages, explaining mathematical concepts while simultaneously describing human emotions and artistic achievements. She sent images of Earth, pictures of humans, recordings of children laughing and birds singing. Commander Vexthal watched the data flow with growing unease. According to every model in their xenological databases, primitive species should either ignore superior technology or react with fear. They should not attempt immediate communication using both logical and emotional approaches simultaneously. The behavior suggested a level of adaptive intelligence that contradicted all their assumptions about pre-contact civilizations. Orders, Commander? Asked Krianath. Vexthal studied the readings for a long moment. The humans had detected them, acknowledged their presence without fear, and immediately attempted complex communication using multiple approaches. This was unprecedented in galactic history. Begin detailed observation protocols, he ordered finally. But maintain distance and stealth? I want to understand what we are dealing with before we proceed. The Xanthari ship settled into a high orbit, its instruments focused on the planet below. They had come expecting to catalog another primitive world, but already they suspected they had found something far more dangerous and unpredictable than anything in their experience. Science Officer Krianath adjusted the long-range sensors to focus on the human settlements below. Her task was simple according to Xanthari protocols: observe the primitive species, catalog their social structures, document their technological capabilities, and assess their potential threat level. She had performed this same analysis on hundreds of worlds, and the results were always predictable. Primitive species fought over resources, built basic shelters, and struggled for survival according to logical evolutionary patterns, but the first observation made her question her equipment. In a large human settlement called Chicago, she watched a male human in bright yellow clothing working on top of a tall structure. Tony Rodriguez had been installing steel beams on the 42nd floor of a new office building when the fire started in the apartment complex across the street. The flames spread quickly through the old wooden structure, and people ran from the building carrying whatever possessions they could save. Krianath watched through her sensors as Tony noticed something the fleeing humans had missed. A small, four-legged creature was trapped on a third-floor balcony, crying in distress as smoke filled the air around it. The logical response, according to every behavioral model in the Xanthari database, would be for Tony to continue his work or move to safety. Individual survival always took priority over non-essential concerns. Instead, Tony dropped his tools and ran toward the burning building. He grabbed a ladder from a fire truck that had just arrived and positioned it against the wall below the trapped animal. The human firefighters shouted at him to stay back, but Tony climbed the ladder anyway, moving through thick smoke toward certain danger to rescue a creature that provided him no evolutionary advantage. Krianath ran the behavioral analysis through her computer 3 times, but the results remained the same. According to Xanthari science, Tony's actions made no logical sense. He risked his life for a non-human creature that belonged to strangers, gaining nothing in return. The computer classified his behavior as a malfunction in survival programming, but Tony was not malfunctioning. He reached the balcony, grabbed the frightened cat, and climbed back down through the smoke and heat. When he reached the ground, he handed the animal to its owners and immediately returned to work as if nothing unusual had happened. The cat's owners thanked him repeatedly, but Tony just shrugged and said it was no big deal. Meanwhile, in a small settlement in the region called Kansas, Krianath observed another puzzling incident. Sam Johnson was a damaged human, his left leg partially missing from some kind of combat injury. According to Xanthari understanding, damaged individuals focused their remaining resources on personal survival and recovery. They certainly did. Not waste resources on others when their own survival was compromised, but Sam was loading his vehicle with supplies during a severe weather event humans called a blizzard. Snow fell heavily and temperatures dropped below survival levels for unprotected humans. Sam drove carefully through the dangerous conditions, stopping at houses throughout his community to deliver food and heating, fuel to elderly humans who could not venture out safely. At each stop, Sam refused payment for the supplies, even though Kreanath's scans showed his own resource levels were dangerously low. When asked why he was helping, Sam simply said that people needed to look out for each other, especially during hard times. He spent his entire monthly resource allocation buying supplies for neighbors, leaving barely enough for his own survival. The computer analysis of Sam's behavior broke completely. No algorithm could explain why a damaged individual would sacrifice resources needed for personal survival to help others who provided no direct benefit. The Xanthari had never encountered such behavior in any species, and their scientific models had no framework for understanding it. Dr. Maria Santos provided the third impossible observation. Kreanath focused her sensors on a medical facility in Detroit where Maria worked as a physician treating injured and sick humans. The facility was overcrowded due to a disease outbreak, and Maria had been working continuously for 18 hours without proper rest. According to Xanthari physiology data, humans required regular sleep cycles for optimal function. Extended work periods without rest led to decreased efficiency, impaired judgment, and eventual physical collapse. Yet Maria continued working, treating patient after patient while her hands shook from exhaustion and her eyes struggled to focus. When her communication device signaled that her own offspring was sick and needed care, Maria arranged for someone else to tend the child but refused to leave her post. "People need help," she told her supervisor when asked why she would not take time to care for her own genetic investment. "I can rest when the crisis is over." Kreanath watched in amazement as Maria sutured wounds with trembling hands, administered medications while swaying from fatigue, and made life-or-death medical decisions despite being far beyond safe operational limits. The doctor's own health was deteriorating, yet she continued prioritizing the welfare of strangers over her personal well-being and family obligations. The science officer attempted to find logical explanations for these behaviors. Perhaps the humans were malfunctioning due to genetic defects or environmental contamination. Maybe their social structure included hidden reward systems that compensated individuals for seemingly irrational acts. She searched for evidence of coercion, mind control, or chemical influences that might explain why humans consistently acted against their own self-interest, but the data showed no such influences. Tony, Sam, and Maria were acting according to their own free will, making conscious choices to prioritize others above themselves. More disturbing still, these behaviors appeared to be common throughout human society. Kreanath's expanded observations revealed thousands of similar incidents occurring simultaneously across the planet. Teachers worked unpaid overtime to help struggling students. Firefighters ran into burning buildings to save strangers. Medical workers treated enemies alongside allies without discrimination. Parents sacrificed personal ambitions for their children's welfare. Strangers helped each other during emergencies without expectation of reward. The behaviors were so widespread that they appeared to be fundamental characteristics of human society, rather than isolated anomalies. This was deeply troubling because it contradicted every principle of evolutionary biology known to galactic science. Species that consistently prioritized others over themselves should have gone extinct long ago, eliminated by more logical competitors who understood the importance of individual survival. Yet humans had not only survived, but thrived. Their population numbered in billions, they had developed complex technologies, and they had begun expanding beyond their homeworld. Somehow, this seemingly self-destructive species had become one of the most successful on their planet. Kreanath compiled her observations into a preliminary report, but she knew Commander Vexthal would question her findings. The data suggested that everything the Xanthari understood about intelligence, evolution, and survival was wrong. Either their science was fundamentally flawed, or humans represented something unprecedented in galactic history. She submitted the report and continued. her observations, knowing that what she had discovered would change how the Xanthari viewed the universe forever. Military analyst Zorduk activated the tactical observation systems with confidence born from centuries of experience cataloging primitive warfare. Every species developed military capabilities in predictable patterns, starting with simple weapons for hunting and personal defense, then advancing to organized group combat, and finally reaching basic strategic thinking. The progression was universal because logical beings understood that warfare was about achieving objectives with minimal resource expenditure and acceptable losses, but as Zordak began studying human military doctrine, his confidence quickly transformed into confusion and then growing alarm. General Kyle Murphy sat in his office at the Pentagon, reviewing satellite imagery and intelligence reports that painted a clear picture of human warfare capabilities. What Zordak saw in those documents challenged every assumption about rational military thinking. Human military doctrine included concepts that seemed designed to maximize rather than minimize casualties. They had strategies called scorched earth tactics, where armies would destroy everything useful in their own territory to deny resources to enemies. They had developed weapons capable of destroying their entire planet multiple times over, guided by a philosophy they called mutually assured destruction. Most disturbing of all, they regularly made decisions that guaranteed the deaths of their own soldiers. In a mountainous region called Afghanistan, Sergeant Nina Brooks led her squad through hostile territory with a mission that made no sense, according to Xanthari military logic. Her orders were to recover the bodies of soldiers who had died in a previous engagement. The dead humans could provide no tactical advantage, contribute nothing to ongoing operations, and required no resources, since they no longer functioned. Yet Nina was risking 8 living soldiers to retrieve dead tissue. Zordak watched through his sensors as Nina's squad moved carefully through enemy territory, knowing they were walking into potential ambush situations for no logical military purpose. When questioned by one of her soldiers about the danger, Nina simply stated that, "We don't leave people behind." The Xanthari military analyst ran this statement through every strategic database, but found no tactical explanation for such behavior. The situation became even more impossible when Nina's squad encountered overwhelming enemy forces during their recovery mission. Logical military doctrine demanded immediate withdrawal to preserve resources and fighting capability. Instead, Nina ordered her soldiers to establish defensive positions around the bodies they had come to retrieve, even though this guaranteed a prolonged firefight against superior numbers. When enemy forces surrounded their position, Nina made a decision that caused Zordak's analysis computers to crash. She called for artillery bombardment on her own position, requesting danger close fire support that would likely kill her entire squad along with the enemy forces. The artillery commander confirmed that the bombardment would almost certainly result in friendly casualties, but Nina insisted on the strike anyway. "Better to die here than let them have our people," she radioed back to command. Zordak watched in stunned amazement as human soldiers deliberately called down explosive death upon themselves rather than retreat and leave behind non-functional tissue that served no military purpose. Colonel Pete Harrison presented another impossible puzzle. Zordak observed the colonel in his office, studying casualty projections for upcoming peacekeeping deployments. The documents clearly showed that certain missions had extremely high probability of soldier deaths, yet Harrison continued to approve these operations. More confusing still, when the most dangerous assignments became available, Harrison volunteered himself for leadership positions. The Xanthari analyst watched Harrison's hands shake as he signed deployment orders, saw him pause to look at photographs of his own offspring displayed on his desk, observed the obvious emotional distress the decisions caused. Yet Harrison continued making choices that would almost certainly result in the deaths of soldiers under his command, including potentially himself. When questioned by subordinates about the logic of accepting such dangerous missions, Harrison explained that peacekeeping required someone to stand between innocent people and those who would harm them. The statement made no tactical sense. Innocent people provided no strategic value, and protecting them offered no military advantage. Yet Harrison was willing to sacrifice trained soldiers, expensive equipment, and years of military investment to protect strangers who contributed nothing to human military capabilities. The pattern repeated throughout human military structures. Pilots volunteered for test flights with 30% fatality rates. Navy crews sailed into storms to rescue vessels belonging to other nations. Special Forces soldiers undertook missions where survival was considered unlikely. Marines charged into enemy fire to protect civilians who provided no tactical benefit. Most disturbing of all was how humans compartmentalized their military behavior. Dr. Rachel Kim worked in a medical facility, treating injured soldiers and civilians from multiple sides of various conflicts. Zordek watched her perform surgery on enemy combatants who had been shooting at human forces only hours earlier, providing the same level of care she gave to her own species warriors. When military police questioned her about treating enemy personnel, Rachel simply stated that they're patients now. She had somehow separated the identities of enemy and patient in her mind, allowing her to heal the same individuals her species was simultaneously trying to kill. The psychological framework required to maintain such contradictory positions was beyond Xanthari understanding. Air Force Captain Steve Chun provided another example of impossible human behavior. Zordok observed him testing experimental aircraft with documented failure rates that should have made such flights unacceptable risks. When Steve's wingmen died in a test flight crash, logical behavior would have demanded a thorough investigation and safety improvements before resuming operations. Instead, Steve volunteered for the next test flight the same day his colleague died. When asked about his decision, he stated that, "We need to know what went wrong." This suggested that humans were willing to continue risking their lives to understand failures that had already killed their companions, pursuing knowledge even when the cost was clearly demonstrated to be lethal. Zordek compiled his observations into a report that he knew would terrify the Xanthari High Command. Human military doctrine was simultaneously brilliant and insane, combining tactical innovation with strategic decisions that prioritized impossible concepts like honor, duty, and sacrifice over logical objectives like victory and survival. Humans had developed weapons capable of destroying their own planet, yet they also created elaborate rules of engagement designed to protect non-combatants. They would sacrifice expensive equipment and train personnel to recover dead bodies. Yet they also possessed the technical capability to wage war across multiple continents simultaneously. Most alarming of all was the realization that human military thinking was not random or chaotic. There was an underlying logic to their behavior, but it was based on principles that no other galactic species had ever demonstrated. Humans appeared to value abstract concepts like loyalty, honor, and justice more than concrete objectives like territory, resources, or survival. This made them unpredictable and extremely dangerous. An enemy who valued survival could be negotiated with, bargained with, or deterred through superior force. But an enemy who valued abstract principles above their own existence could not be reasoned with using conventional logic. They would fight when fighting was hopeless, sacrifice when sacrifice served no purpose, and continue resisting long after any rational species would have surrendered. Zordok submitted his report and continued his observations, knowing that his findings would force the Xanthari to reconsider everything they thought they knew about warfare and the species capable of waging it. The emergency session of the Xanthari Council of Observers had been called within hours of receiving the latest reports from the observation team. Commander Vexthal stood before the assembled council members, his usual confidence replaced by visible uncertainty. In 3,000 years of galactic exploration, no species had ever generated reports like these. The council chamber, normally filled with routine discussions about resource allocation and territorial expansion, now buzzed with anxious energy. "Hi." Councillor Morthok gestured for silence with two of his forearms while his other hands manipulated data displays showing the human observations. "Commander, your report suggests that this species exhibits behavioral patterns that contradict fundamental principles of evolutionary biology. Are you certain your observation equipment is functioning correctly?" Vexthal activated his personal datapad, displaying footage that had been verified multiple times by different observation teams. The equipment has been tested and recalibrated. Repeatedly, High Counselor. The behaviors are consistent across all human populations and appear to be fundamental characteristics rather than isolated anomalies. On the main display screen, the Council watched Dr. Rachel Kim working in her medical facility in Los Angeles. 2 human males had been brought to her hospital after shooting each other during what the humans called a gang conflict. The wounded individuals had been actively trying to kill each other less than 3 hours earlier. Yet Rachel treated them in adjacent, operating rooms with identical care and attention. When questioned by law enforcement officials about the security risks of treating violent criminals, Rachel's response sent murmurs of confusion through the council chamber. "They're patients now?" she said simply, as if that statement explained everything. "I don't ask about their crimes when they're bleeding on my table." Council member Lexandra leaned forward in her observation chair. "Commander, how do we explain this compartmentalization of identity roles? According to our psychological models, beings cannot simultaneously view others as both threats and beneficiaries without experiencing severe mental dysfunction." But Rachel showed no signs of mental dysfunction. She performed complex surgical procedures with steady hands, made life-or-death medical decisions with clear thinking, and maintained emotional stability despite treating individuals who represented active dangers to her society. More confusing still, this behavior appeared to be supported by human medical doctrine rather than being considered an aberration. The Council's attention shifted to another display, showing Air Force Captain Steve Chun at a military testing facility. The human was preparing to pilot an experimental aircraft with documented mechanical problems that had killed his colleague the same morning. Rational beings would have demanded extensive safety improvements before risking additional lives, but Steve was volunteering for immediate test flights. "We need to know what went wrong," Steve explained to his commanding officer. "If we wait for perfect safety, we'll never advance the technology." The statement revealed a fundamental difference in how humans approached risk and progress compared to every other known species. Xanthari advancement occurred through careful, methodical testing with extensive safety protocols. Losses were minimized through thorough preparation and conservative approaches. But humans seemed to accept catastrophic failure as an acceptable cost of rapid progress, willingly sacrificing individuals to gain knowledge that might benefit their species in the long term. Security Chief Carinal activated tactical displays, showing human military capabilities alongside their behavioral observations. "Council members, we face an unprecedented strategic challenge. This species possesses nuclear weapons capable of destroying their planet, yet they also demonstrate willingness to sacrifice themselves for abstract principles. How do we predict the behavior of beings who might choose mutual annihilation over logical compromise?" The question sent a chill through the council chamber. Every galactic conflict in Xanthari history had been resolved through logical negotiation once the costs became clear. Species that faced extinction chose survival over pride, accepted reasonable terms over mutual destruction, and prioritized their continued existence above temporary objectives. But human military doctrine suggested they might not follow these logical patterns. Their concept of mutually assured destruction implied willingness to destroy their entire civilization rather than submit to conquest. Their military history showed repeated examples of small groups fighting to the death against overwhelming odds, rather than surrendering when defeat was inevitable. "Commander, Vexthal displayed additional footage showing kindergarten teacher Betty Adams reading stories to young humans in an educational facility. The content of the stories was deeply disturbing from a Xanthari perspective. Human children were being taught about heroes who sacrificed their lives to save others, warriors who chose death over dishonor, and leaders who put their people's welfare above their own survival. They are deliberately programming their offspring with self-destructive behavioral patterns," observed Council Member Yexther. "These stories teach children that individual survival is less important than group welfare and abstract principles. They are creating generations of beings who will choose death over logical compromise. Yet the same children were also being taught to share resources, resolve conflicts through communication rather than violence, and show compassion to those different from themselves. Betty Adams followed stories about heroic sacrifice with lessons about kindness, cooperation, and peaceful problem-solving. The humans were simultaneously conditioning their young for both extreme violence and extreme compassion. High Counselor Morthok studied the behavioral analysis data with growing concern. The psychological profile suggests that humans can hold contradictory belief systems without experiencing cognitive dysfunction. They can value both individual life and heroic death, both peaceful cooperation and violent resistance, both logical thinking and emotional decision-making. This cognitive flexibility made humans extremely unpredictable. Xanthari negotiators could prepare for logical opponents who would act in their own self-interest. But how could anyone prepare for beings who might suddenly prioritize honor over survival, compassion over logic, or group welfare over individual benefit? The debate continued for hours as council members struggled to categorize humanity within existing frameworks. Half the council argued for immediate containment, viewing humans as an existential threat to galactic stability. A species this unpredictable and dangerous could not be allowed to develop faster than light travel and spread throughout the galaxy. The other half argued for cautious contact, suggesting that human adaptability and resilience could make them valuable allies if properly managed. Their willingness to sacrifice for others, combined with their rapid technological advancement, might provide benefits that outweighed the risks. Commander Vexthal listened to the arguments while reviewing his final observations. He had saved the most disturbing footage for last, knowing it would influence the council's final decision. The recording showed ordinary humans going about their daily activities while simultaneously planning for their children's futures, creating art that would outlast their own lives, and building institutions designed to benefit generations not yet born. Humans were simultaneously planning for their own deaths and their species' immortality. They accepted personal mortality while working toward collective survival. They made decisions based on consequences they would never live to see, sacrificing immediate benefits for long-term advantages that would only help their descendants. Council members, Vexthal said finally, I believe we are observing a species that has somehow evolved beyond the normal constraints of individual survival. They have developed the ability to think and act as a collective organism while maintaining individual consciousness and free will. This makes them unlike anything else in the galaxy. The council fell silent as the implications became clear. Humanity represented either the next stage of evolutionary development or a dangerous aberration that threatened the established order of galactic civilization. Either way, the decision about first contact would determine not just humanity's future, but the future of the entire galaxy. High Counselor Mortha called for a recess, knowing that the final vote would require careful consideration of consequences that none of them could fully predict. Dr. Ashley Taylor stood before the United Nations Assembly in New York, her presentation displaying images and data that represented decades of archaeological research. The Xanthari observation team focused their sensors on the gathering, expecting to catalog another routine example of human information sharing. Instead, what they witnessed fundamentally changed their understanding of human nature and sent waves of horror through their command structure. Ashley's presentation revealed the complete story of human migration across their planet, but it was not the triumph of intelligence and planning that the aliens expected. The data showed a species that had survived multiple extinction events, ice ages, volcanic catastrophes, and climate changes that should have eliminated any rational life form. But humans had not survived through logical adaptation or careful planning. They had survived by deliberately walking into the most dangerous places on their planet and somehow making them habitable. Our ancestors left Africa approximately 70,000 years ago, Ashley explained to the assembled diplomats. Not because conditions at home were poor, but because they saw empty lands and decided to fill them. The Xanthari listening to the translation struggled to understand the implications. Humans had abandoned safe habitable territory to colonize regions that were actively hostile to life. The migration patterns made no evolutionary sense. Humans had crossed frozen wastelands during ice ages, traversed burning deserts where water was scarce, sailed across vast oceans without knowing what lay beyond the horizon. They had climbed mountain ranges that should have been impassable, settled in valleys prone to flooding and earthquakes, and built cities in locations that experienced regular natural disasters. Commander Vexthal watched the presentation with growing unease as Ashley displayed evidence of human settlements in places no rational species would consider habitable. Humans lived on the slopes of active volcanoes, in regions where hurricanes struck regularly, on fault lines where earthquakes were common, and in valleys that flooded every few years. Instead of avoiding these dangers, they had developed technologies and strategies to survive them. But the most disturbing revelation came when Ashley showed archived footage of modern human recreational activities. The Xanthari realized that what they had interpreted as survival behavior was actually what humans did for entertainment. Humans deliberately sought out potentially lethal experiences and called it adventure tourism. Biologist Nathan Ford was shown teaching a university class about human recreational risk-taking. His students watched videos of humans climbing the highest mountains on their planet, diving to the deepest parts of their oceans, and launching themselves from aircraft with nothing but fabric wings for protection. Nathan explained that millions of humans paid significant resources to participate in activities that offered no survival benefit and carried substantial risk of death. Base jumping, free climbing, deep sea diving, extreme skiing, Nathan listed while showing footage of each activity. These pursuits offer no evolutionary advantage, yet humans are drawn to them repeatedly. We seem to have an innate drive to test our limits against natural forces that could easily kill us. The aliens struggled to process this information. Every other species they had encountered avoided unnecessary risks and sought safe, comfortable environments. The concept of deliberately pursuing danger for emotional satisfaction was unprecedented in galactic biology. Yet humans had built entire industries around providing increasingly dangerous recreational experiences. Captain Sophie Wells provided an even more troubling example when her ship, the USS Defiance, responded to a distress call during a severe storm. Military protocols clearly stated that rescue operations should be delayed during dangerous weather conditions to avoid unnecessary risks to rescue personnel. But Sophie ordered her crew into the storm anyway, explaining that sailors don't abandon sailors. The Xanthari watched in amazement as Sophie's crew battled massive waves and hurricane-force winds to reach a cargo vessel that was breaking apart in the storm. The rescue operation risked an entire military ship and trained crew to save civilians, who provided no strategic value. When asked about the logic of such decisions, Sophie's response was simple: "It's what we do." The aliens began to understand that humans had somehow evolved past normal survival instincts. Rather than avoiding danger, they seemed compelled to confront it directly. Rather than seeking safety, they actively pursued challenges that tested their physical and mental limits. This behavior extended beyond individual choices to become fundamental characteristics of human civilization. Archaeological evidence showed that humans had always chosen the difficult path over the easy one. When faced with natural barriers like mountains, oceans, or deserts, humans did not seek ways around them. Instead, they developed technologies and techniques to go through them, over them, or under them. When confronted with hostile environments, they did not retreat to safer territories. They adapted the environments to suit their needs or adapted themselves to survive in impossible conditions. Dr. Ashley Taylor's presentation included disturbing evidence that humans had repeatedly survived catastrophes that eliminated other species on their planet. Massive volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, climate changes, and disease outbreaks had wiped out countless life forms, but humans had somehow persisted. Not through superior technology or intelligence, but through sheer stubborn refusal to accept extinction. The Xanthari realized they were observing a species that had essentially conquered their own planet through persistence rather than logic. Humans had spread to every continent, including frozen wastelands at both poles. They had built permanent settlements in deserts, jungles, mountains, and islands. They had even begun expanding beyond their planet, launching themselves into space. Using controlled explosions and living in artificial habitats where any equipment failure could mean instant death, Commander Vexthal compiled this information into a report that would terrify the Xanthari leadership. Humans were not just unpredictable in their social behaviors. They were fundamentally different from every other known species in their relationship with danger and survival. Where other species sought to minimize risk, humans seemed to thrive on it. Where other species avoided challenges, humans actively sought them out. This made humans far more dangerous than initial observations had suggested. A species that voluntarily lived on active volcanoes and dove into crushing ocean depths for recreation would not be deterred by conventional threats. A species that had survived multiple planetary catastrophes through sheer determination would not be easily intimidated or conquered. The archaeological evidence suggested that challenging humans might actually make them stronger and more determined rather than discouraging them. Their history showed repeated examples of humans becoming more innovative, more cooperative, and more resilient when faced with seemingly impossible obstacles. Nathan Ford's biology class provided the final piece of the puzzle when he explained human stress response systems. Unlike other species that became less functional under pressure, humans actually improved their performance during crisis situations. Stress triggered enhanced physical capabilities, improved mental focus, and increased pain tolerance. Humans literally became more capable when facing mortal danger. The Xanthari observation team transmitted their findings to the Council with a recommendation that fundamentally altered the strategic assessment. Humans were not just intellectually unpredictable. They were biologically adapted for surviving and thriving in conditions that would destroy other species. They had evolved to seek out challenges, overcome obstacles, and persist in the face of overwhelming odds. Contact with such a species would be unlike anything in galactic history. Humans could not be evaluated using conventional frameworks because they operated according to principles that no other species had ever demonstrated. They were simultaneously more dangerous and more resilient than initial reports had suggested. The Council would have to decide whether to make contact with beings who treated mortal danger as entertainment and had conquered their planet through sheer refusal to accept limitations. The Xanthari fleet held position at the edge of the solar system while the Council of Observers deliberated humanity's fate. 12 massive ships containing the combined military and scientific might of a galactic empire waited for orders that would determine whether first contact proceeded or whether humanity would face immediate containment. The debate had raged for days as council members struggled with a decision unlike any in their 3,000-year history of exploration. High Counselor Morthek presided over the final session with visible tension radiating from his scaled features. The evidence was overwhelming and contradictory. Humans displayed behaviors that ranged from incomprehensible compassion to terrifying determination. They were simultaneously the most caring and most dangerous species ever encountered, capable of extreme sacrifice for strangers while possessing weapons that could destroy their own planet. "The military assessment is clear," announced Security Chief Carnal, his voice carrying the weight of strategic analysis. "This species cannot be predicted using conventional models. They value abstract concepts above survival, pursue danger for recreation, and have demonstrated willingness to fight to extinction rather than accept logical surrender. If they develop faster than light travel, they could destabilize the entire galactic order." Council member Lexandra disagreed with equal conviction. "The same evidence suggests they could become invaluable allies. Their adaptability is unprecedented, their technological advancement is rapid, and their capacity for cooperation under pressure exceeds anything we have observed. A species that routinely sacrifices for others might prove more trustworthy than those motivated purely by self-interest." Commander Vexthal listened to the debate while monitoring final observations from the surface. His team had compiled thousands of hours of footage showing humans in every conceivable situation, yet the contradictions only became more pronounced with additional data. Every attempt to categorize human behavior revealed new aspects that defied logical analysis. As the council prepared for their final vote, Vexthal requested permission to share one last observation. The main display activated to show a small building in a human settlement, filled with young humans no more than 5 or 6 years of their species' maturation cycles. Teacher Betty Adams sat surrounded by children, reading from a book while they listened with rapt attention. The story she read was about heroes who sacrificed themselves to save their communities, warriors who chose death over dishonor, and leaders who put others' welfare above their own survival. The Xanthari Council had heard similar stories before and understood their disturbing implications for human psychological development. But Betty did not stop with tales of heroic sacrifice. After finishing the adventure story, she gathered the children in a circle and began teaching them about sharing, cooperation, and peaceful conflict resolution. When 2 children argued over a toy, she helped them find a solution that satisfied both parties. When another child felt excluded from a game, she gently guided the group to include everyone. When snack time arrived, she ensured that children with more food shared with those who had less. This is what makes humans truly unique, Vexthal explained to the Silent Council. They consciously attempt to evolve beyond their own nature. They recognize their capacity for violence and actively teach their offspring to choose compassion instead. They understand their tendency toward selfishness and deliberately train their children to consider others' welfare. The footage showed Betty reading stories about friendship, kindness, and understanding differences. She taught the children to use words instead of physical force when disagreements arose. She rewarded cooperation and discouraged aggression. She modeled behavior that prioritized group harmony over individual advantage. Most remarkably, the children responded positively to these lessons. Despite their species' demonstrated capacity for violence and competition, these young humans learned to share resources, include outsiders, and resolve conflicts peacefully. They were being deliberately programmed to transcend their biological inheritance and choose higher principles. They are consciously trying to become better than they are, Vexthal continued. Every generation teaches the next to be more compassionate, more cooperative, more capable of controlling their destructive impulses. They have recognized their own flaws and are working systematically to overcome them. The implications were staggering. Humans were not just an unpredictable species operating on dangerous principles. They were a species in transition, actively evolving their social behaviors through conscious effort rather than natural selection. They had identified their own capacity for evil and were choosing to pursue good instead, High Counselor Morthok studied the footage of Betty's classroom with new understanding. Human children were learning that strength should protect the weak, that resources should be shared fairly, that differences should be celebrated rather than feared. They were being taught to value cooperation over competition, understanding over ignorance, peace over conflict, but they were also learning about heroes who stood against tyranny, warriors who defended the innocent, and leaders who made hard choices for the greater good. Humans were not trying to eliminate their capacity for violence. They were learning to channel it toward protecting rather than conquering, defending rather than attacking, serving rather than dominating. The council chamber fell silent as members processed this revelation. Humanity's contradictory nature was not a flaw or malfunction. It was evidence of a species consciously evolving beyond their biological programming. They retained their capacity for violence and competition while adding layers of compassion and cooperation that allowed them to function as a unified civilization. Council members, Morthok said finally, we have discovered something unprecedented. A species that has begun consciously directing its own evolution. They are attempting to retain their survival capabilities while developing higher ethical frameworks. They want to be both strong enough to face any challenge and wise enough to choose the right response. The vote was closer than anyone expected. Those favoring containment argued that humans were too unpredictable and dangerous to be trusted with galactic-level technology. Though supporting contact maintained that a species actively trying to improve itself deserved the chance to join. The galactic community, Commander Vexthal cast the deciding vote by sharing his personal observation. In all his years of exploration, he had never encountered a species that consistently chose hope over fear, growth over stagnation, cooperation over domination. Humans might be dangerous, but they were dangerous in service of principles that could benefit the entire galaxy. The decision was made to attempt contact, but cautiously and gradually. The Xanthari would begin with simple mathematical communications to establish basic understanding, then slowly introduce more complex concepts as trust developed. They would monitor human responses carefully and maintain the option to withdraw if contact proved unsuccessful. Dr. Lisa Campbell was working late at the radio observatory when her equipment detected the first deliberate signal from space. Mathematical sequences flowed through her receivers, starting with prime numbers and advancing to more complex equations. The pattern was clearly artificial and obviously intelligent. Her hands shook as she prepared humanity's response, knowing that this moment would change everything. She transmitted the same mathematical sequence back to show understanding, then added Batch's Ode to Joy, because she believed that any species capable of mathematics might also appreciate beauty. High above Earth, Commander Vexthal received the response with satisfaction and trepidation. The humans had answered with both logic and emotion, just as his observations had predicted. They were welcoming contact while simultaneously demonstrating their complex nature. The Xanthari ship slowly began moving toward Earth, its crew knowing they were about to make contact with a species unlike any other in the galaxy. They had seen what humans were capable of, both terrible and wonderful, and they would never forget the lessons learned during their observation. Humanity was about to join a galactic community that had no idea how much they were about to change. The aliens had come expecting to catalog another primitive world, but they had discovered something far more significant, a species that proved intelligence could evolve beyond its origins and choose to become something greater than survival. Alone demanded, the future was uncertain, but for the first time in galactic history, it was also full of hope.